Okay, so first of all, thanks the organizing committee to allow me to comment on this paper. That is very insightful and very interesting in terms of acknowledging that the world is not just one world, it's a bunch of different regions that everybody has different endowments, everybody has different weather relationships, and that heterogeneity matters, and they show that matters a lot. So what are they trying to convince us? They're trying to convince us that they show a bunch of plots like that, where they show us that temperature, they have GDP, they have sensitivity from temperature to GDP. It's different across regions, it's different across time. And they're trying to convince us, and they do, and they are very convincing in doing that, in their job, that taking the world as a whole, maybe losing a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the effects of climate change come not from the aggregate, that is still very important if you think as a global ecosystem, but the heterogeneity and the distributional effect of climate change can be of first order. So what does the paper do? They build a global general equilibrium model with high degree of geographical resolution. They have 19,000 regions. I don't know what kind of computer they used to solve that, but that's what it is. They have heterogeneity across region, across time, on temperature, on productivity, on the elasticities between temperature and productivity. And basically the idea is that energy production leads to carbon emissions. Carbon emission leads to increases in temperature. And then changes in regional temperature are linked to change in productivity with an inverted U shape that, as he showed just before, means that in Siberia, they pretty much like to be have a little more sun, but probably in Brazil, they have enough hot already, and they heat it already, and they will probably get less productive the higher the temperature. Then they show that carbon taxes are needed for agents to internalize the effect that production has in global temperature, in global warming, and then how that affects to their productivity. Okay, so what are the main insights from the paper? First of all, is that heterogeneity matters, and it matters a lot. Okay, so that's probably the main insight of the paper, and that the effects of temperature rising are very different across regions, and also that the effects that a common global carbon tax have big disparity in their effects. Some region could face like 30% in consumption equivalent losses, while other region can actually have 10% gains in consumption equivalent. And that, of course, if you are trying to negotiate one global tax, poses a lot of issues. So what are the taxes if some people are going to lose, some people are going to get? And overall, the idea of the paper, they show us that climate change leads to big increase in global inequality. And perhaps more interestingly, because we're always shown that capital mobility matters and change everything, here it apparently doesn't change much. That if are intra-regional there you can invest, it's no different than if you could flew capital from one country to another. So now I'm going to say that, as I say, they make the big point that heterogeneity matters. Now what I'm going to show that maybe different dimension of heterogeneity also matters. And the first one is something that is discussed a lot in Chile, that the effect of endowments, green energy transition, and input complementarities. So we can see at the left, we have a map where different countries has show their proven oil reserves, and at the right we have the lithium reserve, where lithium is generally acknowledged to be a big winner in the green transition because they are needed to store electricity in batteries, and all the green transition it's very complementary to building batteries. So, for example, well, in Chile we have no oil, and we have a lot of lithium. So probably a green transition, it will be a net gain for us in this dimension. And then you see Venezuela, it's the opposite. You have a black there, a black dot at the north of South America. They have a lot of oil, but if you see the right plot, they have no lithium. So for them, it's probably a really painful transition to green energy, where they're gonna have to probably import a lot, probably don't have much to do with their exports. And that could, of course, increase the change when our assessment of who are the winners and who are the losers. We probably could have a similar plot where you can see that average sun per day in different countries is probably very heterogeneous. Average wind and stability of the wind is probably pretty heterogeneous across countries. And there's a lot of heterogeneities that I want to put the point that if we are moving in a transition towards a greener energy, the complementarities of each country's endowments could be a big factor in determining who are the overall winners and overall losers from the transition that apparently is something that is going to happen. Okay? Yeah. So in the base model, this psi t, I think it's the x, it's a reduced form variable that shows how green is the prevailing energy bundle. And importantly, it does not affect the cost and efficiency of energy production. Now, if this assumption holds or not on average may not be of great importance for the overall conclusion of the paper. But however, the fact that the transition toward green energy may affect countries heterogeneously, depending on their endowments, being commodities, being wind, being solar availability, can have relevant implication in the distribution of who's the winners and who's the losers of going green. The good thing is that the implementation should be straightforward. That's like the energy technology function that come from the paper. And the blue thing, the Z, is a technology that you could add that basically say that the prevailing energy bundle, the greenness of the prevailing energy bundle, could have a different complementarity with the endowments that the country already has. So some countries like Venezuela could have that as we move to higher greener energy, the complementarity with their natural endowments goes down. Maybe Chile, that has a lot of place for wind, has a lot of place for solar, has a lot of lithium to make batteries, who have a higher complementarity between their endowments and the costs and benefits of going green and be part of having a greener energy. So that's one of the things that I think will offer a lot who's the winners or who's the loser. I mean, here we have like Russia that is big in oil. We already have the heterogeneity that comes from temperature with all the northern part. But okay, this could have another dimension. Okay, maybe Russia will be not so good with a green transition because, well, their main commodity is now not of so high demand. And well, of course, you have the US that, as always, has a bunch of everything. So I don't know if they're going to be better or worse with this dimension. But so that's a point. Another kind of like heterogeneity is related to biases and learning. So this is a nice map that I got from a paper from Lee and co-authors from 2015 that basically plots survey answers about the awareness of climate change. And not only the awareness of climate change, but the people that are aware that climate is a thing. It's an important thing. It's something that we should be care about. And one, not everybody thinks the same. And second, the people that actually think it's a zero threat is disappointingly low, in my opinion. I mean, this is 2015. Maybe now it's a bit better. So an important thing is like if you see the US, for example, you see India, you see China, you have three big countries with a lot of population, a lot of political power, and they don't seem to care too much about climate change. So on the one hand, you have the US and you have China, where there's plenty of people that agree that climate change is a thing, but if you move to the right part of the chart, they don't really think that is something that we should be worried about. On the other hand, we have India, that very few people think that climate change is even a thing, but at least those that think about it, you can see that it's very, very dark red in the red line. At least those that think that climate change exists, they think it's a zero threat. So, but overall, you have a lot of big countries with a lot of political power, with a lot of people that are not really sure that this is a thing. So, like within the framework of the model, the perception of existence and dangers of climate change might be biased. And if elected politicians or policymakers don't fully internalize the consequences of climate change, that in this reduced form, I'm saying that maybe the perceived elasticity from carbon to temperature and from temperature to productivity may be biased, it is likely that the prescribed tax that they would like to have will deviate from optimal. Now, hopefully, there's a learning process where D hat and T hat converge to D and T. And of course, in a simple signal extraction problem, you could evaluate something like that. And then geographical difference in the signal-to-noise ratio could lead to this heterogeneity. So maybe countries that have higher volatility in temperature find it harder to assess the difference that comes from this shock. But maybe it's not that easy. Maybe people, especially with things that climate change, don't behave like an optimal structure signal extraction agents, and behave some more like, the 5 stages of grief. Maybe they start with denial, they slowly go through anger, say why this is happening, who's guilty of this, and then go back and forth and eventually get to acceptance that this is a deal. Of course, those non-linearity in a person are hard to predict, but on average, a regional prediction could be made, and you could think that this could be predicted with a simple linear regression where you think, okay, maybe countries that are bound to get good news with the green transition are more likely to accept the existence of climate change, and I don't know. So, concluding, I have 10 seconds. This is a compelling paper on the quantitative importance of climate change and welfare, but even more important is a very compelling paper on the importance of regional heterogeneity. And what I'm proposing is that incorporating some additional sources of heterogeneity may improve the model predictions. And I propose 2 such possible extensions that I think would be a good way to improve on the model prediction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamín. So now we have some time for questions from the audience. Yes, Jim.
Great. This is really terrific work. I'd love to hear a little bit more. So this U-shape curve of TFP as a function of temperature is obviously sort of a key piece that's driving this. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the micro evidence for that. So for productivity, that makes a lot of sense, and agricultural productivity, that makes sense, and labor outdoors and so forth. But TFP, sort of think about knowledge spillovers and inventions. You think of, I think of that as being sort of fairly mobile, and you can imagine that being more mobile going forward. And then there's a question of what sort of you focus on inventions doing, and those might well be the areas that are actually the most stressed. So you think about the innovations in crops during the Dust Bowl and post in response to climate. A lot of that was driven on, like, where are the real problems in agriculture, and so where do we need to do the innovation and new varieties. So so I guess a little more evidence on the U-shaped curve would be interesting.
Thank you. I have a question, taking the moderator's prerogative. So we have some results tomorrow in joint work with Elias that shows migration actually responds to climate events. And you have an assumption that migration is not a variable in your model. But if it was, how would you change the analysis on inequality? Because once you allow people to move, then there's a difference between the inequality at the regional level and inequality at the personal level. So maybe the inequality results are a bit sensitive to the existence or not of migration. Yes.
Thank you so much for a great presentation here. I had a question on one of the things you raised in the last couple of slides you had about some of the next steps. And you mentioned when linking with Earth systems models, one of the challenges is that these are chaotic, nonlinear dynamic systems, and that this can, I'm assuming, would lead to challenges in the solution method of the linked economic models. I was wondering if you could just first off, provide any more thoughts that you might have on that, unless it's too new. But secondly, I'm curious if there is a thought here, a good, reasoned, principled approach to answering what do you do if the Earth systems model cannot solve? Do we still report the results of that in our economics model, or do we actually have a risk that we would run here of only having ourselves look at model runs from the Earth systems models that do successfully solve? Could that potentially introduce some sort of bias in our analysis? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any other questions?
So,
yes, Luigi.
I have a comment. So, of course, this is a comment which applies to most climate models, and the one I will present to. And is the fact that, of course, productivity, temperature has an impact on productivity, but let's not forget that institutions matter a lot. And you could take the example of the California and Mexico, where they have very similar temperature, and yet they have completely different institutions, and to some extent there are also differences in economic performance. And I mean there might be examples which are of course more extremes, but I think that's a point I want to make, and of course it fits into the popular debate with Acemoglu on one side and Diamond on the other on whether whether climate is in the end, a driver of economic growth or not.
Okay, thanks. Tony, plenty of questions.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, well, thanks for the great comments and the great questions. I'm not sure I can answer them all right now, but let me first say, to my discussant, there's the two dimensions of heterogeneity that I hadn't considered before, and I think that they're certainly very doable in this framework. So we do view it as a platform, and we can handle a lot of heterogeneity. Even in autarky, we can solve a lot of different dynamic programs allowing for full heterogeneity on a parallel computer. So I think the allowing the energy production function to vary by region seems very valuable. We've done a little bit of that in a new version. We're working on it. And then recognizing that there are different endowment. I think there's two separate points. One, there's a different endowments as well. So lithium might be traded then as oil is traded, and that might affect regions as well. So I think those are things that we can incorporate for sure in the model, I think, without difficulty. And then awareness of climate change, that's another interesting point. And again, it's something one could do here. Is a question, I suppose, of how many different dimensions of heterogeneity one might want to study, but maybe that's the point of the research, is to try them out. And the learning, having different signal-to-noise ratios in different regions, fits right in with my last couple slides where we showed temperature shocks of very different processes in different regions. So if you're just looking locally to figure out what's going on, say with damages, as a function of regional temperature, it might take you longer or shorter to figure this out. So that's good. Yeah, the question that Jim raised, a harder one, I think we are pretty much sticking with the Nordhaus tradition, which one can criticize. It's just like bundling everything into TFP. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And, I don't think that's fully satisfactory in the end. I think we need to unbundle that. And we don't have a lot to say there. Certainly, there's micro evidence on if you look at the risk of mortality, this Greenstone et al. Paper, they add everything up and they get a nice convex curve. It doesn't look that different from a Nordhaus damage function, but only coming from mortality risk. Or for things like that, maybe agriculture, and then that's an aggregate, but also they show U-shapes by region for mortality, depending on what your starting temperature is. So it's not so different from what we're doing. But whether we should bundle innovation, into TFP, probably not. I think so. I don't have a great answer there. I think you need a richer framework to study these things. I think some of Cruz and Rossi-Hensberg work allows for endogenous growth. I suppose that maybe then there could be some responses from climate policy or climate change to endogenous growth. I don't think it's quite on innovation in agriculture, but they do allow some feedbacks there. I think it's a great question, and it just goes at how measuring damage is hard work. And we've kind of punted on that a little bit. We want to be consistent with these aggregate numbers, and come up with a regional detail. I think is consistent with the aggregate numbers, but then we should push way harder on these damage functions. That's on my last slide too, to some extent too. I think migration is very important, and this is a very good point on. I guess it's a general point of how you measure inequality. Do we measure it across countries, or do we lump everyone in the world together? Inequality across countries seems to have gone up some, maybe, but inequality across peoples maybe gone down because China and India have grown so much over the past 40 years. We don't have migration, but it'd be awesome to calculate that calculation. To do that calculation when we get there, we can study migration pressures in our model, so we can calculate how much would you gain if you could move. And these are large numbers. We've also thought about allowing for full mobility within a country, but not across countries. I think that we can solve and still retain forward-looking consumption savings behavior. But I think it's a great question. Interacting chaotic systems with macro models. So our idea is that the agents in the model, and this is a great question, and we're still working on this, so it's more speculative, but our idea is that we're going to represent these chaotic dynamics by linear systems or nonlinear systems even with shocks. So the agents just think they're just random shocks out there. And that's the way they form their expectations. And then we can solve this using these approximate expectations. We still have some fixed point iteration to do between the two models, because we have to confirm that when you solve the model forwards using the actual dynamics of NOR-ESM. Now, it takes a while to run, but I think it's feasible to do, actually. We don't have to do so many iterations back and forth. So then you'd have to confirm that the approximate expectations based on shocks kind of are reasonable. But there's some level at which the agents are never getting it right, because I don't know how to put chaos into a nonlinear, into a dynamic macro model with forward-looking behavior. And in fact, when you first see these pictures, I thought it's like, okay, you're making a mistake, because yesterday you showed me a picture with the temperature a year from now is 2 degrees lower than it is now, and the climatologist said, well, we just changed the initial condition by a little bit, and so it led to a big change a year from now. It's like, okay, that is amazing. So I guess I should have known that, but seeing it in practice is quite interesting. So I think we can solve it. It's just a question of whether you buy into our scheme of using approximate expectations. And then finally, institutions mattering for productivity. So remember, in the model, we do have an exogenous component of productivity that's designed to capture institutions. So we can match the distribution of GDP across countries initially. But the question might be more, maybe those institutions affect how you respond to climate change as well. And there we're making kind of identifying assumption that that different countries can respond just as, that the institutions, your education system or your political system don't interact with how you respond to a change in your temperature. And that's probably not a great assumption either. One can imagine allowing for heterogeneity and the ability to respond to shocks. Not quite sure how to do that, but it's another dimension of heterogeneity that might be important to incorporate that we haven't yet. All right, but thanks for all the great comments and great discussion.
Thank you very much, Tony. Let's close with a round of applause for Tony and his discussant.